Hello again. Welcome back to the Norton lecture series, Spending the War Without You. We're still not in Cambridge since things aren't quite open yet. So at the moment, I'm just walking around in Chalkroom, a virtual reality place I made with my collaborator, Shen Wang. We built this place out of words and signs, and it's pretty vast. So you can fly through here in any direction. You can walk along planks and move through frames and into different spaces and hallways, and using your arms stretched out in front of you to navigate. Now in the real world, you'd be wearing a really big headset, and you'd be picking your route with virtual hands. Now, there are a few navigation devices around here, like these white cubes, and you could use them to find your way around, make some choices about which way to move. But it's also very easy to get very lost. Once in a while, while passing a hallway, you may hear a voice or maybe a question. What are days for? To wake us up. To put between the endless nights. What are nights for? To fall through time into another world. Sometimes it feels to me like I'm walking around in my mind. It's not about depicting the real world with its rooms and people and trees. A world where pictures and sounds from the outside are turned into signs and symbols and sketches. Chalkroom is a place where meaning gets made. It's basically a story machine. And in VR, you're everything. The actor, the viewer, and the creator. Just the way you are in your dreams, really. You're the one who's making up the world. And you're watching yourself while you're doing it. Why is it always raining in my dreams? I'm on a talk show. Love your new book, says the host. I haven't written a book. It's a lot like talking to yourself. But I try to go along with this anyway. But you know, one of my secret motivations in making VR was to break the gaming rules and to make something that wasn't about shooting and scoring and getting stuff, but that was more about just, wandering and getting lost and taking the wrong turn and finding yourself who knows where. Chalkroom is full of stories and dreams, half remembered. I had this dream, and in it my mother is sitting there cutting out pictures of hamsters from magazines. And it uses the logic of dreams, and sometimes the logic you might find in the stranger laws about time and physics. And finally, here we are, on the way to the forest. And it's a different kind of tree here, made out of information, of code. And everything is falling. Now, for a year now, we've been living in a world that many people describe as unreal. And we've been living with a virus whose code is extremely difficult to crack, since it just keeps changing. And it's like a bizarre experiment. Let's see what happens if no one in the world touched anyone else for an entire year and lived apart and ate alone or with a couple of other people and lived near their screens. What would happen? We don't know the answer to that yet. But it's strange. Now that things are starting to open up again, A lot of people I know are worried. What will the real world look like now? And will they want me in that world? Welcome to the forest. Today, we're going to look at how sound and image combine and how they work in the spaces that we create, from spectacle to inside our heads, and what it is to be lost, and what solitude has become. It's spring of 2021, and there have been some strange late snows, but lots of things are beginning again. And you know, one of my favorite first lines is in Dante's poem, Divine Comedy from the 14th century, and it starts out in the woods, in the dark, and the poet is lost, and he says, "In the middle of my life, I find myself lost." I find myself lost. What does this actually mean? Now, this poem was in many ways the first work of modern fiction, and it pointed the way to how stories and words work, how they can be mysterious and paradoxical, how you can simultaneously be the one who's looking and the one who's being looked for. It's called fiction. But you know, lots of stories start with being lost in forests. On the other hand, it's getting harder to get lost in the forest because we've lost so many of the forests. But that's a whole different story. It's funny. Sometimes there are no words for things that we experience. Meanwhile, there's a new word for snow, and it's spelled S-N-A-U-X, and it means fake snow or faux snow. And it's the snow you see on the shoulders of mannequins in store windows at Christmas. We're also missing a lot of words. There's the Inuit word, ikturuapok, and it means a feeling of edgy anticipation that makes one keep looking out the window to see if an unexpected visitor is coming up the path. And from German, there's Waldeinsamkeit, or forest loneliness, which doesn't mean the trees are lonely. It means the joy you feel when you're in the woods all by yourself. Meanwhile, I've become a tree hugger. Maybe it's about wanting to embrace things that are no longer there. Hold on to them, protect them. It always keeps coming back to the body. But I just want to say that if you have a boa constrictor as a pet, the kind that coils itself around your neck and twines around your chest and waist, you know, one thing to look out for when you're lying in bed is if the boa constrictor stretches itself out right next to you. Look out, because what it's doing is comparing your lengths to see if it can manage to swallow you whole. Reminds me of the first chapter of The Little Prince, when he made his first drawing, and he asked people if they were afraid of it. And they said, "Why would I be afraid of a hat?" And he said, "This is not a hat. This is an elephant who's been swallowed by a boa constrictor." But you know, it's easy to be afraid of things that are hidden or disguised. Murky, undefined things can seem so dangerous. And I always think of Mark Twain in this context when he said, "Some of the worst things in my life never happened." I dreamed I was a dog in a dog show. And my father came to the dog show, and he said, "That's a really good dog. I like that dog." in a world made of words, you start with nothing, even less than a vacuum if that's possible. So in VR, the first thing we built was air. And we made this air out of the tiniest fragments, sometimes microscopic letters, sometimes DNA symbols, and we swirled them around in currents to create a sense of space and atmosphere and depth. And these tiny elements were also used as the building blocks of things in the viewable material world. And this is a scene from our story called To the Moon, and it's about a NASA proposal to ship all the radioactive waste and toxic manufacturing systems from the Earth up to the Moon. A plan that seems to have stalled somewhere in the depths of Congress. So in this case, we added atmosphere in the form of electronic trash, which is in permanent orbit around the Moon. So why are we constructing these worlds? What are they for? And I'm thinking of the ancient Chinese painter who spent years making a huge vertical mountain with groves of pine trees and a steep road winding up to the top, and waterfalls and tiny people with walking sticks and thatched bamboo huts here and there for hikers and fishermen casting their nets in the sea far below. And he painted with a brush that had only a single hair from a badger. And the painting was very, very intricate. And it took him many, many years to make it. And when the painter finished the painting, he walked into it. Now, after building these digital worlds, we put them in the real world. But we wanted the experience to be physical and social. And so instead of just hanging headsets in the museum walls, we made transitional spaces full of the same imagery so that you could shift more gradually from this world to that one. Now, VR is not taken that seriously in the film world, but some film festivals have been presenting VR installations recently, although maybe a little reluctantly. In Venice, the VR pieces were installed on an island called Lazaretto Vecchio, separate from the rest of the festival. Now, Lazaretto Vecchio was the first quarantine island established in 1423, where they isolated lepers and Black Plague victims. So this gives you some idea how people who love cinema feel about VR. Now here's a quarantine tent with some Black Plague victims in it, and oddly, this tent was exactly on the site where we put our VR tent in the festival installation in 2019, which was a kind of transitional space for viewers. And in fact, we were trying to reference the Italian beach cabanas over on the Lido where shy people could change into their suits. But back to contagion and quarantines, VR has virtually disappeared because it's so hard to disinfect the headsets. Before the pandemic, we did a big VR show at the Cannes Film Festival, and they gave us the abandoned morgue for the installation. Turns out, vaults were perfect for us. And again, you get the picture of the place of techno cinema in festivals. One of the pieces we showed was called A Loft, and it began with a plane that disintegrated, leaving you floating out in space in your chair. And we put a loft in a room that was the shape of an airline interior, and we used the casket incineration openings as windows, as well as installing the regulation safety lights in the aisle. Now, the following year, I was on the VR jury in Venice, and we had to see about 40 works. And this is a lot harder than seeing film, since the headset is sort of locked onto your head, and it gets incredibly heavy after hours of looking. And many of the works in the competition had been made by big teams and were extremely elaborate fantasies of imaginary realms with very optimistic plots about the world healing itself and turning back into a kind of Eden, thanks to technology. But we were a jury that was more skeptical. We gave the biggest prize to a Nigerian artist whose work was basically a 3D movie, and it was called Daughters of Chibok. And it tells the story of the parents of the girls who were kidnapped and forced into slavery in 2014 by the Islamic terrorist group Boko Haram. And the film is about what happened to the parents as they waited for years for news of their daughters, and how they waited and how many of these parents died from grief. I mean, who dies of grief anymore? Who loves anyone enough to die from it? For us, this was the most radical idea. Before there was virtual reality, the word virtual used to mean almost, as in, I have virtually no time, or I have virtually no interest in that. So this is the almost world, something we continuously invent. And I'm thinking of the poet, Robert Creeley, whose student asked him, "Is that a real poem? Or did you just make that up?" I love music. It has a lot of air in it. You're not sure where it's going. It's what I find hard about purely digital music. It's made in one box, and it goes directly into another box. It never pushes through the air. It just doesn't travel that way. You know, once, I was asked to make a lobby sound bigger than it was. Now, when you walk into a lobby, you hear how big it is before you see it. So you can do things like add a lot of reverb to make things sound a lot farther apart than they actually are. You know, when you're playing the violin in Carnegie Hall, it's an instrument that you play with a lot of compression and vibrato. To make sounds that can project long distances and carry to the upper balconies. And also sound good in the sweet spot, dead center, row K, where you put all your friends. But to the violinist, whose head is right next to the instrument, sounds are completely different. The creaking and the horsehair bow, just sticky with rosin, scraping over the wound steel strings, the raspy roughness, the overtones, the harmonics. So in my own music, I bring these sounds up off the noise floor to make them the building blocks of the music, along with some processing. some people think of electronics as kind of cold and somewhat distant, but electronics can create real intimacy. And I'm thinking of how many people had their first love affairs on a phone, when you could talk directly into someone's ear. And if you said something stupid, you could just hang up right away. A while ago, I walked into a huge recording studio, and in the middle of the studio was a man wearing no clothes, and he was playing a flute, and he was covered with flies. And there were these enormous mics on booms all over the room. And when I got closer, I saw that the flies were actually tiny microphones attached all over his body, and these mics picked up every little sound. So the engineers kept saying, we can hear your shirt rustling, can you take that off? And a little bit later, your parents are really loud, they're gonna have to go too. The shoes are deafening. And so he was just standing there shivering and playing. And there were mics inside the flute too, that recorded the breath as it blew through the tube and turned into notes. And in the mix of this piece, the sounds from all the microphones combined into a huge symphony. And when you put headphones on, the sound was so spatial. The breath rushes into one ear and curves around the top of your skull in chords and harmonics, and then turns around and blows out the other ear. So being in your head was not like being in a head full of brains, blood, and teeth. It was like being in an enormous, drafty barn, full of light and emptiness, and the winds of music. There are some sounds that stay in your head. They get caught there. And sometimes it's like you're not even aware that you're listening, but you're moving along with their tempo. More like remembering. And I'm thinking of Spalding Gray, and he was one of the world's great storytellers. And I wrote music for two of his films, Swimming to Cambodia and Monster in a Box. And the films were performances of his long stories. And many of them were about looking for things, like looking for a perfect moment, or stories about being lost. And the films were basically Spalding at a desk with a glass of water and a notebook. So the music wasn't really competing with landscapes or action. So it had a lot of weight. You could make a joke sound sad, or something serious sound really funny or dark or heart-wrenching. But in the end, it was Spalding's face and body and voice that told the story. I remember a gesture that Spalding made when he was talking about memory, and he struck an invisible match. And he said, "Remember this?" And then he lit an invisible candle. And he said, "Remember this?" Remember this? I'm thinking of the day the filmmaker Wim Wenders called me from Cannes, where he was mixing the sound for his film, Wings of Desire. And he was running out of time. The premiere was in a couple of days, and he needed some music. for a few of the scenes. So he called me and he said, "Do you have any angel fragments?" And strangely, I kind of knew what he meant. So I sent him a cassette and I said, "Here's some sketches, and if you like it in them, I can record like a real version for you." And he did what every composer fears. He used the work tape. But he's so smart, he put the music in a man's headphones. And so you heard it as headphone leakage, which explained its lo-fi quality. So here's the scene.
Liegt immer ein Kreis über Berlin. Einmal wird's abstürzen. Und schön kalt. Meine Hände waren immer warm. Ist eigentlich ein gutes Zeichen. Knirscht so unter meinen Füßen. Wie spät es wohl ist. Die Sonne geht schon unter.
A man on a rooftop approaches the edge. He's wearing headphones, so he can't hear the people who are yelling for him to stop.
Marke spart. So die Sonne im Rücken. Links der Stern. Ist gut eigentlich. Sonne und Stern. Ihre kleinen Füße.
There are a few angels in this film, but they're not allowed to interfere with the lives of
Ganz
people.
alleine. Jetzt, ob sie meinen Brief schon hat. Ich will nicht, dass sie den Brief schon gelesen hat. Aber die sagt mir,
Here comes one of them.
Havel. Ist das nun ein Fluss oder ein See? Hab ich nie begriffen.
The angel puts his head on a man's shoulder.
Oder was? Im Osten?
I can hear his thoughts.
Was sie schreien, ist mir egal. Ist mir doch egal. Diese ganzen Gedanken. Ich möchte eigentlich gar nicht mehr denken. Ich gehe.
The man jumps. It made me think of the myth about the origin of the philtrum, this groove between the nose and the mouth. In this story, Layla is the angel of conception, who teaches the entire Torah to the unborn child. And when the child is born, the angel places a finger here to seal the child's lips, and it leaves this mark, a sign that means quiet. And also, forget this. Sometimes, in interviews, people ask me, "Who are you talking to in these songs?" And once, just without thinking, I said, "I'm talking to the part of you that never speaks." Not to complain too much about Zoom or how many cameras are everywhere these days, but this relentless camera is on all the time, and it really drives me crazy. So for these talks, I've decided to use virtual backgrounds. And so I can just, disappear once in a while and hide out. Just not be there until it's safe to come back out again. But when I walk in the woods, I often think about mushroom hunting and how much fun it would be, and about John Cage and how mushrooms related to his music, and how he said, "What right do I have to be in the woods if the woods are not in me?" He also said, "I've spent many pleasant hours in the woods conducting performances of my silent piece." He explained how he made maybe his most well-known work for piano, called 433, which consists of 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence. And he said, I built it up gradually out of many bits of silence. I have nothing to say, and I am saying it. And that is poetry, as I need it. Most of my work as an artist has been talking on stages, and strangely, stages are among the best places in the world to hide. You can light yourself the way you want and control the way people hear you, and you can leave when it's over. I remember when cameras suddenly became a big part of music festivals. I was playing in the Montreux Jazz Festival, and this was maybe late 80s, and Claude Nobbs, the founder and the head of the festival, came to me and he said he had this great idea to put cameras all over the stage. And he did this, and I remember how awful it was to be on the stage where suddenly, like, your face, your hands, and magnified on these huge screens behind you and everywhere. And anyway, it instantly became a different kind of show, with a whole lot less music. But the first performances I did in the 70s were stories with songs and film and electronics, and I did these in film festivals. And by film festival, I mean 8 people in a room looking at each other's movies. And I never finished the soundtrack in time, so I would stand in front of the film and talk and play the violin, pretty much what I do now. And I made a lot of the films as music. I'd painstakingly black out the frames, so both sound and image were based on this different number series. And they were basically songs made of light. When working with musicians, I often have to conduct a basic beat. So I use a lot of loops, and they're in complicated patterns. They're almost never 4/4. And in this song, Smoke Rings, I try to conduct the beat and show them the structure by doing a kind of like conducting dance, which emphasized the downbeat by beating on my heart and alternately a kind of salute. So the beat was so here I'm playing the digital violin, which I worked on with Matthews, to my synclavier, and the sound is the sound of computer graphics. We used a Nikon computer and mixed it with this volcanic sound. It meant it. The backup singers, I don't think, ever quite got this little conducting thing. They went back to their sort of backup singer, simplified. In between songs in this film, which was called Home of the Brave, we put little interludes, and in this case, it was a phone call. It was just to give musicians a break between things. And so this was William Burroughs calling in, I think. Yeah.
Hey,
phone drops in.
Long time no see.
And,
You know, I'd rather see this on TV.
Couple things to say.
Tones it down.
You know, in many ways, music and images are linked for me, and in the performance called Delusion, there are many screens with all sorts of images on lots of screens, and they were like kind of like instruments in a band. It was like making also giant paintings and then creating these counterpoint between the images and the sounds, and they began to move at different rates against each other. In the film called Hidden Inside Mountains that I made for Expo in Japan in 2005, I used a lot of small cameras hidden within the sets, like in this one. And the point was to make movies within movies and to blend the stage action with the cameras and to be able to move up and out of the scene. I also did a lot of site-specific music and garden projects with nature and electronics in that expo. This whole series of work was based on the writing of Dogen, a 13th century Japanese Zen master who wrote the book Enlightenment Unfolds. And the central question of this book is what in nature is aware and what is not. You should study the Green Mountains using numerous worlds as your standards, he wrote. Green Mountains master walking, and Eastern Mountains master traveling on water. There are mountains hidden inside mountains, and mountains hidden inside hiddenness. We don't know where we come from. We don't know what we are. When I was a kid, I was a pagan. I would talk to flowers, and when bad things happened, I went out to the woods where I had a fort, and I talked to trees and clouds, and I believed that trees could listen. And when I was in my room, I imagined the wallpaper and the curtains were somehow alive and that they not only listened, but somehow that they also remembered. So a few years ago, when I learned about the visual microphone a team at MIT was working on, I was beyond excited. And to learn that this could really happen. Objects could really be listening and recording what they heard through the visual microphone. Now, the way the team explained the visual microphone was simple. Sound waves hit objects and you make them vibrate. And if you make a very high-speed visual recording, you can, with the right algorithm, play back that sound. So let's say I'm talking to you, and let's say we're in the real world, the world that has air that moves, and the sound waves of my voice hit you, making your hair move in the tiniest, most infinitesimal ways. And it's kind of swaying around. And if you had a hair player, you could convert the visual waves back into sound waves, and we could hear what I'd said to you. Now, in their experiment, first they played a song for a plant, and they shot the video of the plant moving, which was only by 1/100th of a pixel, just almost nothing, and it sounded like this. And then the plant went back into audio, and it sounded like this. This is basically what the plant heard and played back for them. Now, basically, you'd recognize that song. Shazam could recognize that song. Next, they played the poem Mary Had a Little Lamb, which was also Edison's test word for the telephone, to a bag of chips. And this time they were filming through glass just to make it more difficult.
Mary had a little lamb whose fleece was white as snow. And everywhere that Mary went, that lamb was sure to go.
And the sound made the vulnerable bag of chips vibrate, and they filmed these minute vibrations. So here's what the chips were able to record and play back.
Mary had a little lamb whose fleece was white as snow. And everywhere that Mary went, that lamb was sure to go.
Now, you can imagine how dense and complicated this could get, all this recording and all this filing and storage system of all these recordings as well. Which night did I talk to my curtains as a child? Which trees did I talk to, and in what forest, or what year, on what continent? There would be a record of everything, and everything would be happening at once. This is the time, and this is the record of the time. This is the time, and this is the record of the time. Now, I love maps. They give you a way out. You probably know the app Radio Garden. Radio Garden is a great way to listen to live radio around the world. You just spin it around and you can listen wherever. Right now, I guess New Caledonia is happening at that very moment in New Caledonia. And if you're a DJ with an exotic party coming up, check out the app Radio, and you can go back in time as well. You can hear what Cairo was listening to in, for example, 1929. It's like a global vision of Bruce Chatwin's book Songlines, in which he talks about walking along the Aboriginal path of creation. And this act of walking calls out the music of dreamtime of their ancestors. And he writes, music is a memory bank for finding one's way about the world. For me, Making spatial music is clearest when it's about a dance score. Sometimes I literally had to write music about moving through space. Now, Trisha Brown was a choreographer, and I worked with her on several things, and she used space very, very radically in her work. The first time I saw Trisha, she was rehearsing on the floor of 112 Green Street in Soho, and I remember what it was like to look down and see all those dancers lying down. They were swimming or crawling, and they looked so far away from above. They also walked up buildings and climbed up to the Soho water towers. So we were always looking up at them and hardly ever across. Now, Trisha asked me to write some music about falling for her dance Set and Reset. I'm always falling in this dance, she said. Can you write something about that? So I wrote some melodic lines that literally kept falling like a shepherd's tone in reverse. And at the time I was writing about falling angels, so I was already thinking about gravity and what it's like to fall through space. And Trisha was working on different ways to fall then, and it was never falling like crumpling or stumbling. She flung herself. And when she fell forward, it was the way a ladder would fall, describing a wide arc straight down as it detaches from the wall, and she'd catch herself just before she hit the ground. Then she'd stand back up and start pinwheeling around the studio, her arms and legs making these big X patterns. And much later, she did a dance titled, I'm going to toss my arms, and if you catch them, they're yours. The last time I saw Trisha, we laughed a lot. She was such a punster. Trisha was so funny. And we spent a lot of time just straight up laughing. And I had heard recently that she had started to suffer from Alzheimer's, but as we talked, I really didn't see it. She was just like my old friend again. But in the middle of the conversation, she looked at me and she said, Dear, what did you say your name was again? And the best part of this was that after a minute, we were laughing again. I wanted you. And I was looking for you. But I couldn't find you. I wanted you. And I was looking for you all day. But I couldn't find you. I couldn't find you. You're walking, and you don't always realize it, but you're always falling. With each step, you fall forward slightly, and then catch yourself from falling. Over and over, you're falling, and then catching yourself from falling. And this is how you can be walking and falling at the same time. The music that I wrote for Trisha's dance eventually became a song called Gravity's Angel. And I wrote this when I was reading Gravity's Rainbow by Thomas Pynchon. I loved that book and his sense of humor. And I had begun to see it as scenes in an opera. And so I wrote him a letter and I said, I really love your book. And could you possibly allow me to make an opera based on it? Now, Pynchon is a really famous recluse, so I didn't think I'd ever actually hear from him. But I got a letter and he wrote, I love your music. And of course, I'd be happy if you made an opera based on my book. And I have only one condition, and that is that the entire opera be scored for solo banjo. Now, some people have the nicest way of saying, no, 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 not over my dead body. Will you make an opera based on my novel? Now, I also made some music for the dancer, Deborah Hay. And she asked me to write some music for her, but I was really nervous because she didn't use music often. And I'd really always thought that her dances were best in silence. And I said, Deborah, I'm not sure about this because maybe, it doesn't need music. And she said, no, this time I'll use music because your music has so much silence in it. So I worked a couple of months and I finished it, and it was for a ballet company. It was to be done for the first time in Sweden. And I finally played it for her, and I was really pretty nervous. And as she listened, she just walked around the studio in circles. And at first, the circles were very small. And then she began to widen them out, and like in a spiral, like orbits of various planets, widening them until eventually she kind of ran into the walls, and then she began walking sideways, like against the wall, sort of like feeling her way along. And she had this kind of odd, sort of distracted look on her face. And she said, could it be just a little softer? I said, well, of course. And I turned it down, and she went back, kind of traveling around the room, and sometimes like skidding in her socks. And so she made these little kind of skating moves and this kind of thing. And then after a while, she said, maybe a little softer. And then a moment later, how about just like a hair down from there? And I turned it down again, and she said, just once more down. Okay, I said. And then she moved around the room for a few minutes and listening. And she finally said, that's perfect. And I said, Deborah, that's off. And eventually, we ended up making a very sort of transparent score. I spent a lot of time in the early 90s working on a music theme park. And this was the brainchild of Peter Gabriel, who was building his real-world studios in the UK and starting with his WOMAD concert series everywhere, experimenting with what world music might mean. And I was a part of a team that included Brian Eno and Ulf Engel and many musicians and people who like to think about this sort of thing. And we talked a lot about how music could shape experience and vice versa, and the real-world theme park was going to feature all kinds of rides and music experiences. There was going to be a quiet club by Eno, and then I think one of my favorites was called The River of Life. And this was a boat ride where you'd pass through the 7 stages of your life, and there would be music for each stage. But the best part of this ride was that you could skip certain stages. For example, you could completely skip your adolescence and just keep, looping around and around your midlife crisis until you finally got it right. And we worked for years through stages of design and engineering and financing and PR, and we finally found the perfect site in Barcelona. And we went there and we spent a couple of days walking around and just trying to picture real world. Now from our site, you could see the outlines of rides on top of this ridge. And they were part of the world's oldest theme park called Tibidabo. This park opened in 1905, and at the time we saw it, the vintage equipment was more than a little rickety. Now, Tibidabo means, I'll give all this to you. And it got its name from a scene from the Bible when the devil is trying to tempt Christ, and he takes him to the top of a hill and he says, I will give this all to you if you just worship me. Now, there's nothing sadder than an out-of-date theme park, especially one with tech that's out of date even before it's finished. We never built real world, and I have to say that there are some things that are better when they're not actually made. They're better as words and ideas than as real things. Now, sometimes I like to try to use the wrong senses. It shows me how things work. So, for example, I try to smell with my ears. And it helps me realize how cut off I am. Because unless you have a sense geared to that frequency, it's like that information or that thing isn't even there. But crossing the senses sometimes works. You can see rhythm, for example, and you can also listen with your eyes. And in music, it's called sight reading. So we're almost at the end of this talk, and endings are hard. So I decided on two endings. Like in one of our VR pieces, there were two different endings. And one was a scene where you're reading the novel Crime and Punishment, and your virtual hands are holding the book, and you're moving like your real hands, but suddenly you realize that they're covered with blood, and you can't shake it off. And suddenly you think, wait a second, who murdered her? Was it me? Did I murder her? The evidence is right here, but you just don't know. And then, if you drop your hands out of the frame, when they come back as like donkey hooves. Now, in the other ending, you land in a field with cherry blossoms falling on you. So we're going to look at this now for a couple of minutes in silence while we wait for Tim Morton, who will join us for the talk. Now, if you can, just kind of lie back and just observe all these visual rhythms. This is an artificial world, but you can imagine the air, the breeze, the fluttering. And like the Dalai Lama said, an artificial flower is just as good as a real flower because it reminds you of the real one. So it's cherry blossom season. We're out of the woods. We'll be back in 2.
The first words I spoke in the original phonograph. A little piece of practical poetry. Mary had a little lamb, its fleece was white as snow, and everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go.
Well, hello everyone. My name's Tim. When I usually introduce myself, I say, hi everyone, my name's Tim, and I write sentences about ecological awareness, which sounds a little bit like, hello, my name's Tim and I'm an alcoholic, and it could be the same, Laurie. Hello, Laurie.
Hello, Tim.
I feel like, you know, I live in this world of ecological sentences, and actually, you know, it's a very loud world. And it's, I think it's too loud. There's not enough quietness in that world. And it's a very kind of boa constrictor world where it's very claustrophobic, you know, and I think we could use a little bit more quietness. And I feel like part of what you were talking about was how language, like it brings things into presence that aren't there, right? Like if I say orange, suddenly there's an orange here, right? But then also there's not an orange. And it also kind of brings in the absence. And it seems to me, as strange as it may sound, that's part of the weird intimacy that we now have with the social distancing. It's tape measure distance, right? Because we are both signaling to each other, we don't want to hurt each other, but that's also intimate in a certain way.
Yeah, hugging an orange is pretty much like a no one's there kind of hug of the of the present.
Yeah. I love not quite knowing what to say. And one of the things he did was this finger on the lips thing. And it made me think of the Greek word muein, which is where we get the word mystery from.
Oh, okay.
And muein is literally when you go, because you can't speak.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of how to say things that you can't sort of say, you know. I feel like we need some of that. We need some of those.
Yeah.
Those
I think that's where humming comes from too, you know, just kind of like looking for something, or just, right before the words happen. And
in a funny way, it's sort of like that quietness or that kind of mystery qualities, and in a funny way, it's from the future, you know. And if anything, I feel like we need to know that another world is possible, but maybe we don't need people shouting about what it should be. Maybe we just need to kind of invite people to visualize kind of like almost anything.
Yeah. I think people feel kind of hysterical now, though, don't you? And they just have to have a picture so that they're going to fit themselves into it instead of just see what happens.
For real. And in my world, everyone's like, well, we've got 10 years to sort this out, and it's real and it's happening and it's an emergency. And so it's very tempting to want to kind of shut down and become very tight. And that immediately makes it very hard for you to even act, you know?
Yeah, I'm sure people ask you that all the time about that clock. And what's your response?
Well, I like to say that if you put an action around a particle accelerator, you'd probably find out that it was made up of lots of little dots of appreciating action. Like if you've, you know, as you've been in a band, you know, right? Like, action in a band means you're kind of listening to the music.
Yeah, it's all listening
to your instrument, and you're listening to your musical lineage. And maybe there's not such a big difference between listening and acting, you know.
Yeah.
And maybe we're a bit too kind of focused on what we have to do, you know.
Achieve. I was hoping you would talk a little bit about that really beautiful song that you just made.
Oh gosh. Well,
because I was, what was the name of that again?
The name of the song, I was thinking about it when you were talking, because the name of the song is This Is a Love Song. And a lot of the time I was seeing the phrase, I find myself lost. And they're the same kind of phrase. If you say this is a love song, part of you is kind of thinking, this isn't a love. It's like it's pointing to itself and kind of not pointing to itself at the same time. And it's kind of like it's in a loop, and it's sort of like you're there, but you're not as there as you might want to be, you know. And it's a song about ecological awareness, right? It's a song about like how hard it is to get the sentence out that you are connected to all these other life forms in a way that kind of works.
What are the first couple of lines of that song? How does it go?
I received a telegram from the animals on the dance floor. And it's like the idea of like right here, right? I mean, I've got little crustaceans in my eyelids, you know, but in a certain way, they're further away for me than what I'm wearing or the lights in this room, because I'm not so connected to them all the time.
Really? Because they're in every shot, kind of.
Yeah, they're right there, you know. And yet, kind of like if you wear glasses, you're always looking at what you see through the glasses rather than like, you know, you have the glasses on. Yeah. And this is a really good time for us to kind of realize that we always have those glasses on. And in a way, like we're always like bags of chips listening to other people saying things into us. And we're doing that to them and they're doing that to us, but maybe not necessarily in a boa constrictor way. But there's some wiggle room in there.
Yeah, there's a lot of wiggle room. Yeah. It's a very empathetic thing to think of how much we bombard each other and change our hairdos.
Yeah, I've changed my hairdo a few times.
I know you have. It's really looking good.
Right. Yeah, just like you know, just quickly. We've got some very lovely questions.
Really?
Yeah. Let's see.
I want to know.
There's a question about VR. And it says, how can we use VR to rethink rather than reaffirm experiences and physical properties? Many properties of physics in VR recapitulate rather than transcend and explore the unlimited and ridiculously imagined. And it sort of spoke to me about that question we're talking about, like things are never quite as they necessarily seem. Or...
Yeah. Well, I think it's not the limitation of VR. You know, it's just to me, it's just like reading a book. Really, it's how you're walking through it and imagining it that makes it interesting. I think, and that's what I was trying to say. A lot of VR is really has the image already that it wants to really project. A perfect world and how you're going to jam yourself into that one. It's so it doesn't. There's no air in there. There's no breathing room in VR, which is why I kept saying, you know, that's the first thing you have to build is atmosphere.
I hope it's not a spoiler. I went to the moon thanks to you, Laurie.
Oh, you did.
I was on the moon there, and at one moment it was as if I had died, because I saw my body floating away in front of me. And so somehow, even though it was in this, as you say, completely immersed claustrophobic space, there was a kind of space feeling, wiggle room feeling.
Yeah.
You know, it was sad because, wow, oh my God, I think I died just then. You know?
Well, don't you feel that way when you're dreaming? Do you see your body doing things sometimes or not?
Yeah, for real. And for me, kind of like the kind of ground state dancing is just being alive, right? And like the ground state being alive is being asleep and dreaming. And what's interesting about a movement like Black Lives Matter, right? They've got this sort of non-violent direct action where you just go limp in the street and you allow the gravity to turn you into that kind of dead weight, right? So the police officer can't lift you. And to me, these is literally about being alive, you know, like wouldn't that be great if we could just be alive rather than surviving all the time?
Yeah, and not just walking around and viewing it as if you're not part of it.
You know, like a drama, like you know the goodies and the baddies and the who's up and who's down, and so you know. May I ask you another question here?
Yes.
I'm fascinated by your idea of spatial sound and what this might mean in an era of drastic environmental change. How might sound teach us how to deal with this spatial crisis?
Oh, well, I'm going to introduce, let's see if I can get to where we are in this world that I'm building here. I'm going to take the world out for a second. This is the green screen where all my stuff is in this room. I'm just like in making this, like punching various iPads to do sounds and things. And this guy Fred was gonna be in this talk, but
Hi, Fred.
this Fred the Head got booted out in the last minute. The binaural recording device, and I think so. He's got little tiny microphones in each ear, and you can really do some ASMR things on him. That's a little bit key. I think I also have one of those people. Let me see if I can find this one. Let's find an ASMR person.
While you're finding it, I'm going to tell people one of my favorite lines of one of my favorite philosophers, who says that
oh, great.
Proust destroys the aristocracy with remorseless gentleness. I think this is the approach.
Remorseless gentleness. Oh, that is so nice.
Right.
Remorseless gentleness is very beautiful. Let's see. Okay, I'm going to find this person. Put her here. And go here. And go to, oh yeah, so this is the ASMR person who is capable of making these very, 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 very long, very, very soothing YouTube pieces, mostly doing things like brushing your hair and chewing gum on your ear. What else do they do on those YouTube channels?
It's almost like a way of allowing your body to be sort of present to itself in a way that isn't so solid, but is again kind of gentle. I feel like almost like there should be a kind of ASMR ethics. We should treat each other like that.
But that would be nice.
Gentle touch.
That would be nice. I feel that when I'm experiencing my head that way, that I don't exactly float away. I feel more like the boundaries of myself and the world, that they in fact get reinforced. And that's weirdly comforting. I don't know why.
Yeah, for real. And actually, when I feel that way, it's funny because the part of me that's a little bit survivory is expecting being real to be more solid, but actually it feels much more like you're walking the wrong way along a travelator. There's all these kind of funny relative motions happening. Never still, right? It's always kind of, everything's shimmering.
But going nowhere.
Yeah. There you go. You can put that on my gravestone, Laurie.
Going nowhere?
Going nowhere. Timothy Morton. So should we see if we can find another question here?
Oh yeah.
Let's see. I love your voice, the tone and pace, and hear it echo in much of the contemporary music that I listen to. It taps into the subconscious, but how conscious is the way that you phrase your performance?
Well, I've heard a couple of times some parodies of me. It's somebody who puts a lot of like pauses, and I'm not doing that stylistically. I just don't know what the next word will be. So I just, the sentences are more like little musical phrases, kind of going here and going there. So, but I do like a lot of air in things. And it's also part of how I see rhythm. I don't see it in a kind of strict way. I like rhythms that are musically more free, that have less obvious beat structures. So, and that's sometimes a little bit strange. I remember once, so a lot of the songs that I have pauses in them. And once I remember, booked into the a jazz festival in Berlin, and I don't know. I just show up these places where I don't necessarily belong, but because I kind of am a floater musically, and so I was in this jazz festival and I'm playing this thing, and there was one pause that was kind of longer than usual, and in that pause, somebody goes, "Play jazz," and I was like, he's got a point. This is a jazz festival. And then my second idea was like, I don't know any jazz. So this is a very awkward moment. But this is part of the way of moving through time that I really enjoy. It's not like ting, 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 but more like sleepwalking through.
Right on. It's like, I'm with Lennon on this. I'd rather fade away than burn out.
Yeah.
You know, responded to Neil, and I'd rather burn out than fade away. And I feel like we need a little bit more of that kind of, if I may say the word, death in this world, rather than this mechanical churning, which is always predictable and we know what we're doing. We'd like just letting things happen. And like people say to me, like, how do you have ideas, Tim? And I'm like, well, actually, I don't have them. And they think I'm being polite or like false modesty. And I'm like, but please, there's a poem by Stevie Smith called Not Waving But Drowning, where it's like,
yes, that's very nice.
drowning here. And you sort of feel like that a little bit.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, exactly.
So
I like that poem.
Somebody asked you about synesthesia. I wonder if you could say a little more about that.
Oh, that's a hobby of mine, you know, or just actually not so much synesthesia as just trying to use the wrong sense. And that, as I was saying, that makes me realize how incredibly limited I am. If I'm just hearing such a little bit of the frequencies that are around. So that's the exercise that reminds me of that, and reminds me of also what I'm listening for, or what I'm looking for, because sometimes that's a little too much about the looking and hearing, is I'm looking for a particular thing rather than just really listening.
Somebody was asking a question about technology. I often wonder what it means when people say it, because for me, for an ant, a leaf is tech, and for a leaf, a tree that they're a part of is the tech, you know. But this question says, how does the relationship between utilizing and criticizing technology changed for you with an ever-increasing level of pervasiveness and speed in culture's technological? And then they say this word subsumption, which I'm afraid I'm not clever enough to know what that means.
I don't either. But I guess we could look it up.
But just imagine it might mean the word progress, maybe.
Let's think of it like that for a second. And I think that I think he was a cryptologist who said this. It's one of my favorite quotes about technology. He said, you know, you think technology will solve your problems, you don't understand technology, and you don't understand your problems. You know, and I think, so of course, if you want to get so-called faster, it's going to work. And I do like to go faster. I am a geek. But what do you say when somebody asks you about technology and it's the future of technology?
Well, kind of, you know, it's about this relationship between walking and falling, right? Like, in a way, we always think technology is like walking, and then when it malfunctions, it's falling. But actually, in a funny way, functioning is just, you know, somebody else is malfunctioning, right? Like when a shark is functioning well, you're about to malfunction because they're about to bite you in half, right? And so, in a funny way, there's no real functioning in the world. And I love this Zen phrase that says "Shoshaku Joshaku," which I think means one continuous malfunction, and it's the principle by which I live, and it's the principle by which we've done this Q&A. You know, and so I feel like allowing things to be failed, I feel like the ecological future, if there is one, is going to feel a little bit failed and hesitant and like false starts. In other words, it's going to be creative as opposed to based on
absolutely
the same thing over and over. And so from our point of view, it might feel like things are kind of malfunctioning, but in a way I sort of love that. And I also love, in a way, the kind of gothy, creepy part of me loves the mal in the malfunctioning, that it's a little bit, something sinister is happening.
Bad functioning. Yeah. I remember when I was in, I think high school, I had a list of like of 10 great people, and people would come on and off the list, and I would just look around, and they were mostly upperclassmen, but they're great people in my world. So, and I would sort of observe them to see what makes these people able to do so many things and be flexible. And I realized that I was looking at them mostly not when they succeeded, but when they failed, because I could see then, like, it's really easy to be a nice person, when everything's going really well, and then when you fall on your face, or when you fail, that's when I was watching them. Like, what do you do then? How do you? What does that do to your sense of who you are, to your self-respect, to your sense of what you're trying to do here?
Talking of which, I have failed in my duty of ending this at exactly 6:30.
Yeah. It's
so it's now
past.
for me to fully put the icing on the cake and say thank you so much, Laurie, for doing this with us and for us. And I hope everybody who's been tuning in has a lovely rest of the evening, day, or whatever it is in your part of the world. And it's nice to share some time with you.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you so much. Goodbye.